Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into another quiet journey through history. We're going to step way back, past the cozy modern world of central heating and those nice electric blankets, and just sink into the dark, damp chill of medieval England. We're not looking at battles or treaties. We're just wondering, how did anyone actually sleep when it was truly painfully cold? Just let the questions settle around you, maybe pull your blanket up a little higher. It's a nice, quiet way to spend the next hour or so. If you're finding this whole sleepy history thing helpful, a soft little click on the subscribe button or a gentle like would be a lovely way to let me know. Thanks. Now, let's go find a drafty, smoky hovel and try to get some rest. Part 1. The constant, pervasive chill. We're going to start in a place of constant, low-level suffering. Not a dramatic, oh no, a siege kind of suffering, but the kind of weary, bone-deep cold that just never seems to leave you from about October until May. Think about the architecture of medieval England. Whether you were a king or a peasant, your home was fundamentally not designed for warmth as we understand it. It was designed to keep out the rain and maybe the worst of the wind. That's about it. Take the peasant's home, the most common structure. It was usually a small, single-room cruck house, or a simple timber-framed affair. The walls were often wattle-and-daub, a charming mix of woven sticks, wattle, and a plaster-like coating of mud, clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung, daub. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? Very breathable, which is to say, very drafty. The roofs were typically thatch. Straw, reeds, heather. This is actually a decent insulator when it's thick and well maintained. But it was also a perfect home for vermin, and it was constantly settling and rotting, creating little gaps. The floor? Just packed earth. A nice, cold, thermal sink ready to suck the heat right out of your feet. And the windows? Oh, the windows. They were often just holes in the wall. Sometimes shuttered with wood, maybe covered with oiled linen, or if you were feeling super fancy and rich, thin sheets of horn. Glass was a ludicrous luxury, almost exclusively for churches or the highest nobility. So what you had was essentially a giant open invitation for cold air. Even with the shutters closed, the wind just whistled through the gaps. Now, where did the warmth come from? The hearth. In the simplest peasant houses, the fire was just a pile of wood and peat on the dirt floor in the middle of the room. There was no chimney, just a hole in the roof, a smoke hole, that hopefully let most of the smoke out. Of course, a significant portion of the smoke didn't go out. It just hung around, settling on the beams, stinging the eyes, and generally contributing to a lovely, smoky atmosphere that was probably contributing to all sorts of respiratory issues, because why not make it worse? This open fire was the center of life. It cooked the food, it provided a bit of light, and it was the only source of heat. But here's the thing about a fire in the middle of a drafty room with a dirt floor. It only heats the immediate area. Step 5 feet away from the blaze, and you're back in the chill. And when the family finally went to bed, they couldn't just leave a roaring bonfire. The fire had to be banked, usually covered with ash and peat, to keep some smoldering embers, the focarius, or curfew fire, until morning. So when they lay down to sleep, the house was quickly, irrevocably returning to the ambient temperature, a temperature that was often just a few degrees warmer than the freezing outdoor air, maybe even colder thanks to the dampness. You have to imagine that sensation, lying down in a cold, smoky, drafty room, with the wind maybe moving the thatch on the roof, and the floor below you just radiating that raw cold into the rest of the air. It's no wonder people thought of winter as a time of great peril and deep exhaustion. It took a massive amount of energy and physical resilience just to exist and maintain a normal body temperature. It wasn't just a cold season, it was an endurance test.
Royal dysfunction and drafty castles. Let's drift over to the other end of the social scale, the nobility, the royalty. Surely the king's chambers were toasty warm, right? Wrong. While the king or a powerful baron was vastly better off than the peasant, their living situation was often structurally just as cold, if not worse, because of the scale and sheer stone mass of their homes. We're talking about castles, massive structures built from stone. Now, stone is wonderful for defense. It resists fire, and it stops a pointy arrow. But stone is also a terrible, terrible thermal material. It has a huge thermal mass. It takes a monumental amount of heat to warm up, and once it's cold, it stays viciously, radiatingly cold for weeks. When the king walks into his private chamber in December, he's not walking into a warm space. He's walking into a giant refrigerator made of ancient gray rock. The heating system here was usually the fireplace, set into a wall. This was a massive architectural step up from the peasant's hearth because it included a chimney, which meant most of the smoke went out of the room instead of into your lungs. A big win for medieval air quality, at least for the elite. But the medieval fireplace was hugely inefficient. They were often large, open, and shallow. A roaring fire would send about 90% of its heat straight up the chimney, dragging a huge amount of cold air into the room to replace the air being drawn up the flue. All that hot, lovely air you just paid a fortune in firewood for? Gone. A fraction of it radiates out into the room. And, of course, the Great Hall, the center of castle life, where everyone ate and sometimes slept, was a catastrophic mess when it came to temperature control. It was a soaring, cavernous room with high ceilings, huge windows, still often just slits or covered with shutters, and massive stone walls. Imagine trying to heat a gymnasium with a single large wood stove. It just doesn't work. The space near the fire is hot. Everywhere else is bitterly cold. The constant need to burn vast amounts of wood led to a huge logistical operation. Forests were managed specifically for fuel. Firewood was currency. It was a massive cost for the noble class, and even they would try to conserve it and only heat the most essential rooms. The king wasn't necessarily wandering around in a perpetually warm castle. He was moving between rooms that had just been aggressively heated for his arrival and other parts of the castle that were basically ice boxes. Now, let's talk about the personal lives of the elites. These people were often plagued by illnesses we would now clear up with a few doses of antibiotics. But back then, the constant cyclical exposure to cold, especially the damp cold, must have been brutal. People constantly suffered from coughs, colds, and fluxes. Imagine being a sickly royal child, maybe a sad, fragile little prince who is already genetically a bit off, thanks to generations of strategic, isolating inbreeding. You spend your entire life shivering in a stone castle. It's no wonder so many of them died young. A great example of this royal dysfunction being paired with a terrible climate is almost any king during the period of the Little Ice Age, which started creeping in during the late medieval period. These were periods of genuinely vicious, relentless cold. Rivers like the Thames would frequently freeze solid enough to hold frost fairs. Imagine King Edward I, a man known for his towering height and stern military competence, the famous Longshanks. Even a man that intimidating had to sleep somewhere, and that somewhere was likely a massive, drafty chamber in a huge, cold stone castle like Carnarvon or Beaumaris. His bed was probably draped with heavy curtains and piled high with furs and wool. He wasn't relying on a radiator. He was relying on strategic textile engineering and sheer determination. Let's drift over to another royal disaster, the simple matter of hygiene in these cold and dark places. The bedding, the body heat, and the bedroom. Since the house couldn't be heated effectively, the only solution was to focus on heating the body and, crucially, heating the bed. This is where the bulk of the medieval defense against the cold truly lay. For the vast majority of people, the poor and middle classes, the bed wasn't the single-person piece of furniture we know today. It was a communal heat engine. In the peasant's house, the entire family, and maybe even their pigs or chickens, which contributed a nice, if pungent, bit of animal thermal mass, would often sleep together in a single pile of straw, sacks, and old cloth near the banked fire. This wasn't necessarily a sign of squalor. It was a deeply sensible survival strategy. Shared body heat is much better insulator than any single layer of wool. 6 people piled together, wrapped in thick woolen blankets and old tunics, were generating and trapping a substantial amount of heat. Their bedding was simple. It was almost always a mattress of straw or chaff, the husks of grain. This needed to be changed frequently because, well, it got dirty, damp, and attracted vermin, but it provided a bulky, insulating layer off the cold, hard earth floor. On top of this, you had coarse woolen blankets, wool being the undisputed thermal champion of the Middle Ages. Now, what about the king? He had his own room, a private chamber or solar. But even this was a cold place. The solution was the 4-poster bed with heavy, voluminous curtains. This wasn't just a status symbol. The massive draped bed was the king's personal insulated sleeping capsule. The heavy velvet, silk, or wool curtains would be drawn completely closed at night, creating a small enclosed space. This little volume of air could then be warmed by the occupant's own body heat. It was a kind of personal tent within the refrigerator of the stone chamber. It took the ambient air temperature and, with the addition of a few warm bodies, a downy mattress for the rich, and heavy furs, raised it to a survivable, perhaps even comfortable level. And the king didn't necessarily sleep alone. It wasn't uncommon for noble beds to be quite full. You might have a groom of the stool, a title much more glamorous than it sounds, essentially the king's closest confidant and valet, or some favored page sleeping in the chamber, sometimes even in the bed, for security and comfort. A couple of extra bodies helping to heat that enclosed capsule was just a bonus. Now let's talk about what people wore to bed. Medieval people, even the wealthy, didn't really undress the way we do. They would often sleep in their underwear, a long linen shirt or chemise, or a specific sleeping gown made of linen or flannel, topped with thick woolen caps. The cap was crucial. We lose a lot of heat through our head, and a good heavy woolen cap was a simple, non-stop way to keep that heat from escaping into the cold chamber air. They would also use bed warmers. For the poor, this might be a warmed brick or stone wrapped in cloth, or even just a plank of wood that was shoved near the fire for a while. For the wealthy, they might have a bedpan, a long-handled copper or brass pan that held hot coals, which would be briefly swept under the sheets to take the initial icy edge off the linen. This whole process, piling in, pulling the curtains, wearing the caps, using the hot stones, shows a complete reliance on textiles and personal insulation rather than ambient air heating. It's a pragmatic, very low-tech solution to a high-tech problem. It just also happens to be a slow, damp, and often smoky way to live. Let's drift over to another royal disaster: the constant low-level warfare against vermin.
The nightly battle against damp and tiny creatures. The biggest problem with all that beautiful thick bedding, the straw, the wool, the heavy draperies, was that it became a perfect habitat for uninvited guests. If the cold didn't kill you, the fleas, lice, and bed bugs were going to drive you absolutely mad. Imagine you finally settle into your straw mattress, piled high with wool and maybe some nice sheepskins. You're beginning to feel that wonderful warmth generated by your own body, and then the itching starts. Fleas were an absolute constant nightmare. They lived in the straw, they lived in the wool, they lived on the animals who lived in your house, and they certainly lived on you. Their bites were just a part of life. They were a constant, low-level irritant that probably made a good night's sleep difficult even when the temperature was fine. And the bed bugs, we think of them as a modern plague, but they've been with us forever. They would hide in the joints of the bed frame, in the folds of the heavy curtains, and in the seams of the mattress. As soon as you lay down and warmed up the area, they would come out to feed. Again, a constant disruption. The lice, head and body, were another issue, and one that even the highest nobility struggled with. They weren't necessarily a sign of neglect, They were just a sign of the times. Clothes were difficult to wash, especially large, thick woolen items, and the sheer impossibility of keeping a thatched roof or a straw mattress completely clean meant that infestation was inevitable. This nightly war against tiny creatures must have been deeply disruptive to sleep. It adds another layer to the misery of a cold winter night. You're not just cold, you're itchy and crawling. The wealthy had some small advantage here. Their mattresses were more likely to be feathers or down, which was less hospitable to vermin than straw, and their sheets were linen, which could be boiled and washed regularly, something the poor couldn't always manage. They also had access to stronger scents and herbs to place amongst their bedding, like lavender and chamomile, which might have helped a tiny bit, or at least covered up some of the general medieval smells. But even the noble life was a bit of a swamp of pestilence and damp. The heavy stone walls of the castle were constantly suffering from dampness. Stone is porous, and medieval castles were often built near rivers or on hills for strategic reasons, places that were inherently moist. That damp air would settle in the unheated chambers, making the cold feel even more penetrating and chilling. It's a very different kind of cold than the dry cold of a modern freezer. It's a wet, clinging, bone-sucking cold that seems to steal the heat right out of your core. This dampness also contributed to the smell. The air in the sleeping chamber, especially after a full night of the bed curtains being drawn closed, must have been incredibly stale and heavy. The smell of unwashed bodies, stale breath, wood smoke clinging to the fabrics, and the general dampness of the room, combined with the smell of the chamber pot, the portable toilet that was often just left in the corner of the room all night, it makes you appreciate the simple pleasure of an open window on a cold night. You can imagine the king waking up, stiff, damp, perhaps scratching a bit, with the smoke smell still clinging to his woolen nightcap and the stone walls radiating that oppressive, heavy cold. And he has to get up, put on his clothes, which have been hanging in the same cold room all night, and go face the day. It paints a picture of a life of constant physical weariness, even for the privileged. The candle and the curfew. When the sun went down, the medieval world truly became dark, deep, profound darkness. The only light came from firelight and candles. For the most part, people relied on tallow candles, which are made from animal fat. They burn fast, they smell terrible, like burning fat because that's what they are, and they produce a very smoky, dim light. They were used sparingly. The wealthy had beeswax candles, which smelled much nicer and burned brighter and cleaner. But even for the king, you couldn't just leave 100 candles burning all night. They were too costly, and it was a huge fire risk. So when the family went to bed, the single source of heat, the fire, was banked, the curfew from the Old French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. The candles were snuffed out, the room and the entire world plunged into near total darkness. This darkness was a huge psychological and physical factor. It was the time of rest, but also a time of vulnerability. Without the fire, the cold set in rapidly. Without the light, the world was left to the sounds, the wind rattling the shutters, the mice scurrying in the thatch, maybe a dog barking in the distance, and the damp silence of a cold stone room. The only way to manage the long, dark nights, which could be 16 hours long in the deep of winter, was to not sleep straight through. The idea of one continuous 8-hour block of sleep is a relatively modern concept. Medieval people often practiced biphasic sleep or segmented sleep. They would go to bed early, shortly after the sunset, around 9 p.m., maybe 10 p.m., and have their first sleep for about 4 or 5 hours. Then, in the middle of the night, between midnight and 2 a.m., they would naturally wake up. This wasn't a problem. It was a normal part of the night. During this wakeful hour, the time between the first and second sleep, people didn't just lie there worrying about whatever medieval people worried about, the plague, the cold, whether their lord was going to suddenly raise the rent. They would get up. In the peasant's house, they might tend the banked fire, maybe put another log on it to get a brief bit of warmth. They might socialize quietly with their family, perhaps share some food or a drink. They would often use this time for prayer or reflection, something that was easier to do in the quiet darkness than during the busy public day. For the noble class, this was a perfect time for an important person to have some private time with his staff or a lover, or to address a pressing, sensitive matter. After about an hour of this quiet, low-activity wakefulness, they would return to bed for their second sleep, which would last until dawn. This segmented sleep pattern was perfectly adapted to a life without artificial light and without the ability to heat the home continuously. It acknowledges the long, dark stretch of the night and makes practical use of it, rather than fighting against it. But even this natural rhythm was dictated by the cold and the darkness. The entire family routine was built around conserving heat and light. The cold drove people to bed early, and the lack of light kept them there. It's a stark contrast to our modern ability to simply turn up the thermostat and extend our day with a flip of a switch. For the medieval person, the winter night was an experience, a multi-stage process of managing the environment and the body, a quiet struggle against the cold, the dark, and the little things that bit in the night.
Strange medieval sleep aids and rituals. The medieval world, especially its wealthy elite, had a variety of strange and often ineffective remedies and rituals designed to aid sleep or at least keep the night terrors at bay. When you are constantly battling cold, damp, disease, and the general misery of a drafty castle, you're going to try anything. The most common was the use of herbal remedies. Poppies were well known for their sedative properties. A preparation made from poppies, often in the form of an herbal wine or a decoction, was a common, albeit potentially addictive and dangerous, way to force sleep. They also used milder sedatives like lettuce, which contains a mild sedative called lactucarum, and various combinations of herbs like chamomile and mullein, often mixed into warm drinks. The warm drink itself was probably as helpful as the herbs, providing a temporary, internal warmth before settling into the cold bed. For the nobility, there was also a spiritual preparation for sleep. The night was seen as a dangerous time, a time when the devil and various malign spirits were more active. Therefore, a good Christian would perform prayers and maybe have a blessing done over their chamber to ensure a safe, peaceful rest. The chamber itself might be decorated with religious images or relics to ward off evil. Now let's talk about the bed itself for the noble class and how it reflected their dysfunctional status. A royal bed was not just a piece of furniture, it was a massive, carved, opulent declaration of status. The king's bed was often his most expensive possession, draped with embroidery, fur, and costly fabrics. This was the place where children were conceived, where important documents were sometimes signed, and where many kings died. It was a seat of power, almost as much as the throne. But this massive, symbolic piece of furniture was often surrounded by courtly intrigue. Imagine a king who is already sickly, miserable, and emotionally broken, not an uncommon type in medieval Europe, where marriages were political, not romantic, and childhoods were harsh. He's lying under layers of heavy furs in his enclosed, curtained bed in a huge, cold room. He might be listening to the wind howl and worrying about a looming rebellion, or whether his wife, whom he despises and who was forced upon him by treaty, is plotting against him. Take a figure like Henry VI of England. He was a king who was notoriously pious, gentle, and utterly useless as a ruler. He suffered from severe mental breakdowns and long periods of catatonia. You can imagine the scene: the great carved, ornate royal bed, the heavy curtains drawn, and inside the king is completely unresponsive, a vegetable. The most powerful man in the kingdom, absolutely broken by the pressures of his life and his own fragility, lying in the oppressive silence of a cold castle, perhaps drooling, while his ambitious, terrifying queen, Margaret of Anjou, is outside the curtains trying to figure out how to rule on his behalf. The bed, designed to provide warmth and comfort, becomes a stage for ultimate dysfunction. It's not a cozy retreat. It's a prison of state,
a place where personal misery is magnified by the cold, the darkness, and the political weight of the crown. The cold didn't care if you were a king or a peasant. It was a great equalizer of physical discomfort. The king just had better quality wool and more people to bring him hot bricks. But the basic mechanism of sleep, getting warm, staying warm, and dealing with the night, was a constant nightly challenge for everyone in that drafty, dark age. The sound of medieval night. To finally drift off, let's just imagine the soundscape of that medieval winter night. No traffic noise, no distant sirens, no hum of a refrigerator or a furnace. The sound is dominated by nature and structure. The wind is constant. It whistles through the arrow slits in the castle walls, it rattles the wooden shutters, and it makes the dry thatch on the peasant's roof sing a high-pitched, reedy tune. The mice and rats, the constant, busy background noise of all pre-modern life. They are everywhere, scurrying through the walls and in the floorboards. Their sound is just part of the night. The fire, even when banked, the fire makes a sound. The gentle hiss and pop of the wood as it settles into embers, the soft rhythmic crackle that is the last sound of heat leaving the wood. The guard's slow footfall. In the castle, you might hear the heavy, slow tread of the night watchman on the stone floor of the corridor outside, a sound that is both comforting, security, and unsettling, a reminder of the danger outside. And the human sounds. Inside the shared warmth of the peasant's pile of bodies, you hear the deep, heavy breathing of people exhausted by a day of hard labor, the quiet snoring, maybe the cough of a child battling the inevitable winter lung trouble, and the constant soft scratching as someone deals with a persistent flea bite. It is a world that is never truly silent, but its sounds are slow, deep, and organic. They are the sounds of survival, of a community huddled together against the overwhelming cold darkness. So, as you're snuggled down now and feeling the lovely, even warmth of your modern bedding, just appreciate the small, wonderful luxury of not being constantly cold, of not having to worry about the mice in the thatch or the damp clinging to your clothes. The medieval world was a heroic struggle just to be warm enough to rest. The logistical nightmare of fuel and fire. As the king shivers in his grand drafty bed, let's consider the logistics of keeping even this marginal warmth going. It wasn't just a matter of having a few logs, it was an entire economy built around fuel. The most effective and thus most expensive fuel was wood. Not just any wood, but specific types cut at the right time and allowed to dry or season properly. If you burn wet, green wood, it gives off massive amounts of smoke, minimal heat, and rapidly clogs up the chimney with creosote, which is a huge fire hazard. Of course, given the constant, desperate need for heat, people often had to burn wood that wasn't perfectly seasoned, because why not make it worse? For the nobility, the need for wood created a massive year-round operation. Royal forests weren't just for hunting deer, they were carefully managed for coppicing and pollarding, specific methods of cutting trees to encourage new growth and provide a sustainable supply of poles and faggots, bundles of small sticks. You needed hundreds, sometimes thousands, of cords of wood to keep a single large castle functioning through a winter. This meant employing woodmen, carters, and laborers just to cut, split, haul, and stack the wood. It was a huge administrative burden, a constant drain on the treasury, and a significant feature of the landscape. When a king moved his court, a common practice known as progress, the huge amount of fuel that had to be procured along the route was a major factor in the decision-making. The locals hated it, naturally, because the arrival of the king often meant the immediate stripping of nearby woods for firewood. For the common people, wood was still the ideal, but they relied heavily on less desirable fuels that were easier to scavenge or cheaper to acquire. Peat. In boggy areas, dried peat, dense, decayed vegetation, was a lifeline. It burns slowly, gives off a lingering heat, but produces a heavy, musty, acrid smoke. It contributes strongly to that pervasive smoky smell we discussed earlier. Turf or cow dung. In treeless areas, people would collect and dry turf, sods of grass and earth, or even dried animal dung, a practice common across many poor, cold areas. These provide some heat but are deeply inefficient, smelly, and fill the air with fine ash. So the heat you finally got was often a trade-off. You could have expensive, clean wood that burned fast, or cheap, smoky peat and dung that left your clothes and lungs coated with grime. And the entire time, even with a great fire, the struggle with drafts continued. A massive royal fire roaring in the Great Hall created a massive vacuum, sucking cold air from every crack and crevice. People would try to combat this by hanging heavy tapestries and thick woven cloths on the stone walls. Again, this wasn't just about decoration or showing off wealth. It was a desperate form of insulation. The tapestries slightly broke the flow of air and prevented the stone walls from radiating their oppressive cold directly onto the occupants. They made the room feel marginally softer and fractionally warmer. Imagine being a young page in the Great Hall, tasked with fetching drinks. You spend half your time standing near the fire, perfectly toasty, and the other half crossing the long, high hall where the air is moving in vast, cold currents, leaving you feeling like you are about to be flash frozen by the draft. This daily cyclical temperature shock must have been incredibly taxing on the body.
The perpetual state of being unwell. The environment of medieval England in winter, cold, damp, smoky, and often unsanitary, did not just make people uncomfortable, it contributed to a perpetual state of low-grade illness and physical dysfunction. Think about the hands and feet. For the vast majority of people, they were constantly cold and damp. Footwear was often just leather, sometimes lined with wool, but rarely waterproofed effectively. Walking through cold, wet mud or snow all day meant your feet were frequently chilled to the bone. This led to frequent cases of chilblains, painful inflammation of small blood vessels in the skin in response to repeated exposure to cold but not freezing air. For the poorest, the constant damp exposure could lead to trench foot, or simply cold weather injury, a nasty condition that resulted from prolonged exposure to wet and cold conditions, causing swelling, pain, and eventually tissue damage. Imagine the king riding in state on a cold day, his feet jammed into cold leather boots, his gloved hands struggling to maintain warmth as he grips the reins. He may have fine gloves, but a royal progress in winter was still a physical hardship. When he dismounts, his courtiers are there to help, but he's still stamping his feet, trying to get the blood flowing. This chronic cold exposure also massively contributed to rheumatism and arthritis. The constant dampness in the stone castles and the field workers' hovel meant the joints were always stressed. A middle-aged noble or peasant was very likely to be constantly battling painful, stiff joints, making simple tasks like riding a horse, or even just climbing the castle stairs, an agonizing daily effort. It's a pain that we might treat with some ibuprofen and a heating pad. They had to rely on herbal poultices and prayer. And then there are the breathing problems. Between the endemic soot and smoke from the open fires and the damp, heavy air, respiratory illnesses were a constant factor. Every royal tomb contained the remains of infants and children who died from the fluxes and coughs of winter. Let's look at the emotionally broken royal children again. A sickly, fragile young prince, perhaps prone to chest infections, is trying to grow up in this environment. He is constantly wrapped in heavy wool, kept close to the fire, probably dosed with poppy preparations to quell the coughing, and watched anxiously by worried courtiers. His entire existence is a battle against the climate. His physical weakness contributes to his emotional fragility, and perhaps his inability to later deal with the brutal realities of kingship.
Edward VI, the sad, sickly son of Henry VIII, is a perfect later example of a child whose short life was defined by the relentless cold and dampness of the Tudor castles and the constant battle against illness. The medieval person's body was a constant battlefield. They didn't just catch a cold. They entered a serious struggle for survival every time the temperature dropped below comfortable. The cold was a silent, powerful force that prunes the population and shaped every single aspect of daily life, from architecture to eating habits. Food, drink, and internal heating. Food was another critical part of the medieval defense against the cold. They understood instinctively that you had to stoke the internal fire. The medieval diet, especially in winter, was geared towards density, fat, and heat. It was less about fresh vegetables, which were hard to come by, and more about stews, pottages, and thick drinks. Pottage, this was the staple, a thick, slow-cooked stew made from grains like oats or barley, vegetables like beans or cabbages, and whatever meat or fish was available. It was cooked over the fire for hours, and its genius lay in its continuous consumption. You didn't just eat one meal. The pottage pot was kept on the fire, bubbling gently all day, allowing people to take a scoop whenever they needed warmth and sustenance. It was a constant source of both calories and heat. And bread and cheese, always present, providing easy, dense energy. Meat and fat. When available, meat was usually heavily salted and preserved. The high fat content in pork or lard was prized, as fat is a wonderful source of slow-burning energy needed to maintain core body temperature. They needed those calories just to run their internal thermostat. And then there was the drink. Medieval people rarely drank plain water, partly because of the risk of contamination, but also because it's cooled and provides no calories. Instead, everyone drank ale or beer. This was often very low alcohol, the small beer or table beer, and was essentially a thin, nutritious gruel. It was safer than water, and when served slightly warmed or brought in from a heated room, provided a minor, temporary, internal boost of warmth. For the nobles, wine was more common, often spiced and sometimes served warmed, hippocras. Imagine the scene at a peasant's table. The family huddled near the smoky banked fire, everyone dipping their spoon into a single thick, steaming bowl of pottage. It's an act of communal, focused warming. Every spoonful is not just filling the stomach, it's putting a little bit of heat back into the body that the cold air is relentlessly stealing away. For the king, the great feasts in the great hall were ironically another demonstration of the cold. The food had to travel long distances from the kitchens to the high table, and the plates were often just earthenware or pewter, which rapidly pulled the heat out of the meal. Unless the king ate very, very quickly, his lavish dinner of roasted meats and fine sauces was probably lukewarm at best. He wasn't having a pleasant, relaxed, hot meal. He was consuming calories rapidly to maintain his status and his core temperature. The entire consumption ritual in winter was a battle against thermodynamics. Every hot drink, every bowl of thick pottage, every piece of fatty meat was a tactical maneuver to delay the inevitable moment when the stone walls and the drafts won and the deep, persistent cold returned to claim the body. The medieval person's diet and their daily cold exposure meant their bodies were simply running hotter than ours, just to survive. They needed that constant caloric input to function as their own small, portable heating units. The politics of the hearth. Even the simple act of having a fire was steeped in social and political meaning in medieval England. For the peasant, the communal hearth was the center of his family's private life, but it was also a place of vulnerability. The fire itself was taxed. A levy called hearth money or fumage, smoke tax, was often paid to the lord or the king. The simple fact that smoke was coming out of your roof hole was proof of your existence and your tax liability. It was an invasive, uncomfortable way for the elite to literally count the poor. For the elite, the Great Hall's massive fireplace was a stage. It wasn't just for warmth, it was a way to display wealth and power. The size of the hearth, the quality of the mantelpiece, and the sheer volume of wood burning in it all served as a public statement. To have a roaring, massive fire in the depth of winter was to say, I am rich enough to command the labor to procure this fuel, and I am powerful enough to use it freely. The seating arrangement near the fire was highly political. The high table, where the lord and lady and their most important guests sat, was typically placed on a dais at the opposite end of the hall from the main entrance, away from the worst drafts. But the real warmth was near the fire. Therefore, sometimes a special private seating area called the bay or oriel was built near a smaller, more exclusive fireplace for the lord's comfort. The servants and lower status people sat closer to the main fire, but they often got the smoke and the drafts from the doors. The king or the lord could dictate exactly who was allowed to enjoy the limited, precious warmth. To be ordered to sit away from the heat was a clear sign of disfavor. The comfort of the body was inextricably linked to the social standing of the individual. It's an ironic contrast. The king, with all his power, is still desperately trying to stay warm, but his solution, the massive roaring fire, becomes another tool of governance. The heat, which is a physical necessity, is transformed into a political commodity. The entire coldness of the environment forces people into shared spaces for warmth. The peasant family pile, the crowded great hall. This enforced proximity means that privacy is almost non-existent. For the poor, life is a constant suffocating closeness. For the king, any attempt at privacy, like retiring to his personal curtained bed, is immediately suspicious, a break from the necessary public political drama of the cold court. So as we imagine the king finally pulling his thick fur-lined covers up to his chin, he is not just an individual trying to sleep. He is a political unit in a constant low-grade war against a climate that threatens to freeze his body and his entire social order.
The quiet resignation to the chill. The medieval winter night, whether experienced by the king in his enormous stone-built refrigerator or by the peasant in his damp, smoky hovel, was fundamentally a time of quiet, deep resignation to the chill. It was a world where cold was the default setting. Warmth was the anomaly, the hard-won, temporary reward for effort, expense, and strategic huddling. The architecture was a failure against the cold, creating drafty, damp, thermally inefficient spaces. The defenses were textiles, thick wool, heavy curtains, and communal sleeping, relying on trapped, shared body heat rather than ambient air temperature. The atmosphere was one of constant discomfort, smoky air, pervasive damp, the itch of vermin, and the chronic ache of cold joints. The logistics of simply burning fuel consumed vast amounts of wealth and labor. The modern mind, used to turning a dial for instant comfort, cannot truly grasp the sheer effort required just to maintain a body temperature above the level of discomfort for 8 hours. It explains so much about the medieval mindset: the high infant mortality, the obsession with thick fabrics and fur, the heavy, fat-rich diet, and the focus on the hearth as the sacred center of the home. The fire wasn't just a convenience, it was a necessary miracle. So, tonight, as you settle in, remember the heavy silence, the pervasive smoke, the cold stone, and the distant howl of the wind. Remember the sleepless historian's lesson. History is often just people trying to stay warm. If you've managed to stay awake through this quiet journey, I commend your stamina. If you've drifted off, then my mission is complete. Thank you for listening, and maybe tomorrow we'll tackle an equally depressing but softly interesting topic like the weirdly dysfunctional eating habits of the Tudors. sweet dreams, and may you never have to sleep on a straw mattress in a stone castle. Royal baths and the illusion of cleanliness. Since we've discussed how desperately cold everything was, let's briefly touch on the royal bath, because the only thing harder than heating a castle was heating a massive volume of water inside that castle. The image of medieval people never bathing is a dramatic exaggeration, but the reality was that bathing, especially in winter, was an enormous, costly logistical undertaking. It was definitely not a casual daily affair. For a king, a proper bath required an entire team of servants to heat and haul the water. They needed huge cauldrons over large fires, and then the heavy, steaming water had to be carried, bucket by bucket, up narrow, cold stone staircases to the king's chamber or bathhouse. By the time it reached the wooden tub, which was probably already sitting in a chilling, stone-walled room, the water temperature would have already dropped significantly. The king would step into a bath that was, at best, lukewarm and slightly smoky. The air outside the tub was freezing, meaning the moment he stood up, he would be hit by a vicious, body-shaking chill. This is why medieval illustrations of baths often show the bather wearing a small cap and having curtains or a tent-like structure around the tub. Again, an attempt to create a small, temporary enclosed volume of warm air. This massive effort meant that even the richest royals might only take a full, immersive bath a few times a year. The rest of the time, cleanliness was a matter of dry cleaning, rubbing the skin with fine linen cloths, changing the inner layer of the linen chemise, the shirt worn against the skin, and using perfumes and scented waters to mask the inevitable stale odor. Imagine the emotional dysfunction of a royal marriage during the winter. The king and the queen are political allies, forced together, perhaps already deeply unhappy. The court is full of intrigue, and they both smell faintly of smoke, sweat, stale wool, and rosewater. This shared, low-grade physical discomfort and lack of true cleanliness just adds another layer to the general misery and lack of romance. There was no escaping the filth and the chill. The bath, when it happened, was a ritual of comfort and luxury, but it was also a vulnerable moment. The king, semi-naked in a warm space, was far from the protection of his guards and the layers of his clothing. It's no wonder bathing was sometimes viewed with suspicion or associated with decadence. It was a brief, costly escape from the constant cold.
Cold watch, guards, battlements, and the peril of snow. While we're talking about the cold, we must consider the people who had the absolute worst of it, the sentries and guards standing watch on the castle ramparts and battlements. The king might be cold in his curtained bed, but the guard was facing the full fury of the elements. Castle defenses were designed to be exposed. You need a clear line of sight, and you don't want cover for attackers. This meant the guards were stationed in unheated, exposed stone towers and on the top of the battlements, which were basically stone walkways open to the wind, rain, and snow. Imagine a guard in the middle of a January night. He's bundled in thick wool and maybe some old leather, but he's standing still for hours, maybe stamping his feet every few minutes. The stone floor is ice cold. The wind is whistling around the merlons, the solid sections of the battlement, and any heat his body generates is immediately stolen by the cold stone and the relentless wind chill. This duty was not just uncomfortable, it was physically dangerous. Guards could suffer from frostbite if the temperature dropped low enough. They had to be regularly rotated, and they relied heavily on strong, cheap ale and fatty food to give them the energy to endure. Their job was pure, grim endurance. A layer of snow on the ramparts added another terrifying dimension. It looked deceptively beautiful, but it was a security nightmare. The snow muffled sound, meaning a surprise attack was harder to detect. More dangerously, the battlements and steps became slick with ice. A guard slipping and falling from the wall was a real and present danger. And the entire castle itself was weakened by the deep cold. Masonry freezes and thaws, potentially cracking the stone and compromising the structure over time. Any water that seeped in could freeze, expanding and slowly prying the blocks apart, a constant maintenance headache that further contributed to the damp and the drafts inside. So, while the king is sleeping fitfully, the life of the castle is maintained by the physical suffering of the men standing watch. Their misery is the price of his marginally warmer sleep. This cold, hard reality is the backdrop to all the political dramas and personal miseries of the royal family. The constant, brutal cold is the silent third character in every medieval history. The mental monotony of the long darkness. Beyond the physical cold, the medieval winter brought with it a profound sense of mental and emotional monotony. The reduction of light and activity drastically changed the pace of life, especially for the elite who weren't out in the fields. For the nobility, the winter meant being stuck. Travel was dangerous and difficult. Roads turned to impassable mud or were blocked by snow. The court often had to settle in one place, a large castle like Windsor or the Tower of London, and the same people were forced into close, continuous proximity for months on end. Imagine a court full of ambitious, dysfunctional people, rival noble families, resentful relatives, forced marriages, and paranoid kings. They are all trapped together in a drafty, cold, dimly lit stone structure for 4 or 5 months. The only light comes from flickering candles and the roar of the smoky fire. The air is stale, and everyone smells a bit off. This confinement must have led to massive levels of boredom, resentment, and tension. The smallest slight could be magnified into a feud. The political maneuvering didn't stop. It just became quieter, more subtle, and far more tense because there was no escape. The long hours of darkness contributed to a psychological slump. Without the stimulation of sunlight and with the constant, low-grade physical discomfort, it's not hard to imagine that seasonal affective disorder was a massive, undiagnosable problem. Everyone was likely tired, listless, and prone to melancholy, the medieval spleen or black bile that was thought to cause depression. A king already suffering from emotional brokenness would find the winter months a prison of the mind. He couldn't ride out to hunt, he couldn't easily lead a military campaign, and he couldn't escape the constant proximity of the people he disliked or mistrusted. His private solar, meant to be a refuge, was probably the coldest room in the house, a monument to stone and draft. His only entertainment was simple: storytellers, music, dice games, and drinking. It's no wonder that excessive drinking and gambling were common winter vices, desperate attempts to introduce some warmth and excitement into the cold, monotonous reality. Good night. May your life be one of warmth, movement, and a refreshing lack of sook. The great danger of fire itself. We've established that the fire was the only defense against the cold, the absolute center of life. But in a world constructed primarily of wood, thatch, and dry textiles, the fire was also the single greatest threat to life and property. The danger of fire in the medieval period was constant, especially in the winter when the need for heat was the highest and fires were burning all day and night. For the peasant, whose fire was simply a pile of embers on a dirt floor beneath a hole in a thatch roof, the risk was astronomical. A tiny ember leaping from the hearth could ignite the dry straw in the roof almost instantly. Add in the high winds of a winter storm, and a small house fire could become a raging inferno in minutes. And because houses in villages were often packed close together, The fire could easily jump from roof to roof, wiping out an entire village in a single night. This is why the curfew bell was so important, the literal signal to cover the fire, couvre-feu. It wasn't just a tradition, it was a public safety measure, a collective attempt to reduce the risk of catastrophe by banking the fire and taking away its roaring potential. For the king and the nobility in their stone castles, the risk was lower, but still significant. The chimneys were the main source of danger. They would rapidly accumulate soot and creosote, especially when burning damp or cheap fuel, which could ignite, turning the chimney into a vertical flamethrower. A chimney fire was terrifying, often forcing people to throw water down the flue or stuff sweat sacks up it to suffocate the flames. The wooden contents of the stone structure were still highly flammable. The floors, the doors, the massive curtained beds, the stored food and textiles. If a fire started in a major castle, like the one that devastated Windsor in the 13th century, or later, the fires that routinely ripped through the Palace of Westminster, it was a disaster of state. The loss wasn't just structural, it was the loss of records, relics, and the physical symbol of the king's power. So, every night, the medieval person went to sleep next to the only thing keeping them alive, which was also the only thing that could instantly kill them and destroy their entire life's possessions. It's an ultimate irony of the cold. The defense mechanism is also the weapon of destruction. This tension between the need for warmth and the fear of fire must have been another quiet, nagging anxiety that made deep, easy sleep a rarity. It adds another layer to the dysfunction of the royal court. The courtiers, sleeping in their crowded chambers, were always one runaway ember away from panic and destruction. The brutal moment of waking. We've talked about the effort of falling asleep, but the moment of waking up in a medieval winter was perhaps the most brutally honest confrontation with the cold. Imagine the young, sickly prince lying cocooned in his massive, curtained bed. His own body heat has made a small, enclosed space that is marginally bearable. He wakes up for his second sleep, or maybe the morning light, such as it is in a cold, gray January, starts to filter through the heavy curtains. The moment he pushes the covers back, the cold shock is instantaneous and total. The ambient air in the chamber, which has been cooling all night, often to near freezing temperatures, hits his warm skin like a physical blow. The dampness makes it even worse. This sudden jolt is not a pleasant, gentle awakening. It's a jolt of pure physical necessity. He has to get dressed, and his clothes have been hanging on a hook in this same icy room. Putting on a heavy linen chemise or a thick woolen tunic that has been absorbing the cold and damp of the stone room all night must have been an act of genuine pain. The fabric would feel icy and stiff. The first desperate task of the day for everyone, from the king to the scullery maid, was to reignite the fire. The king had servants to do this, but even they had to be motivated enough to get out of their own cold beds. The process of getting the banked embers to catch and start a new blaze was meticulous and often smoky. You had to gently blow on the coals, add tinder, and then small kindling, all while battling the raw cold air and trying to avoid filling the room with smoke. For the peasant, this was the moment of most profound effort. Getting out of the communal warm pile meant sacrificing that warmth for the benefit of the family. The first person up was the sacrifice, the one who had to brave the cold of the room and the smoky effort of starting the day's fire. This daily routine, the painful, icy moment of leaving the covers, the shock of cold clothes, and the immediate, desperate need to create fire reinforces the idea that medieval life was a constant, grinding struggle against the elements. The winter wasn't a season to be enjoyed. It was a period of contraction and endurance. The king, though powerful, was just as subject to this brutal morning shock as anyone else. His wealth bought him better wool and servants, but it could not repeal the laws of thermodynamics that governed his cold stone castle. So as we finally wrap up our quiet exploration of the winter chill, let the thoughts settle. Every act, every structure, every political decision was framed by the relentless, cold reality of life in medieval England. A reality that makes our own warm, quiet, easy sleep seem like a miracle of history. Good night once again. Stay warm. The medieval mindset, accepting the inevitable. To fully understand how people slept in this relentless cold, we have to touch upon the medieval mindset itself, a way of thinking that was fundamentally different from our own. For the medieval person, life was generally understood to be hard. There was a quiet, deep acceptance of discomfort, disease, and early death. They did not have the expectation of continuous, easy comfort that we enjoy today. Cold was simply an inevitable, non-negotiable part of the human condition. This acceptance shaped their entire approach to comfort. They didn't view a drafty, freezing room as a design flaw or a problem to be solved with technology. They viewed it as a given fact of existence, like gravity or the turning of the seasons. Their solutions, therefore, were pragmatic, low-tech, and focused on mitigation, not elimination. They mitigated the cold with layers of clothing, with huddled proximity, with heavy food, and with the sacrificial smoky fire. Their goal was not to be warm in our modern sense, but to be not dangerously cold. The absence of freezing was a victory. The absence of death was a triumph. This is why we see the extreme focus on textiles, the tapestries, the curtains, the furs, the heavy blankets. These were the technologies they had, and they used them with an almost religious intensity. The bed, with its curtains, was a sophisticated piece of domestic engineering, designed not to heat the room, but to preserve the heat of the body. For the emotionally broken king, this acceptance also fed his melancholy. He couldn't fix the cold, just as he often couldn't fix the endless political squabbles or the terrible decisions his ancestors had made that led to his own inbred sickly constitution. He was a captive of the climate, just as he was a captive of his crown. The cold, dark winter was the physical manifestation of his own personal internal misery. So when you think of that medieval slumber, don't imagine a frustrated modern person shivering. Imagine someone who has made a peace treaty with the cold. They expect the damp, they expect the drafts, they expect the fleas, and they expect the smoky smell. And when they finally drift off in that communal pile of bodies and wool, they are achieving a hard-won, deeply deserved, yet constantly threatened rest. It is the sleep of ultimate physical exhaustion and quiet resignation. May your own sleep be filled with none of that resignation and all the quiet. Sweet dreams and good night.